Hi everyone and welcome back to New House's YouTube channel. I'm here today to talk to you all things tenant fee ban, an exciting piece of legislation that is coming in as of the 1st of June 2019. We have finally had the guidance notes out from the government, so I can now give you the final overview of what we can and can't do, and everyone can start getting things into place ready for the tenant fee ban to come into action. So before we kickstart, for those of you that don't know who I am, I thought I'd better introduce myself. I'm Emily, I'm the director here at New House. I'm in charge of sorting out all the legislation side of things in the background to make sure that we are ready and raring to go for the tenant fee ban and for every other change in legislation that they're currently trying to throw at us. I've had really good feedback so far. People are really liking the videos and actually getting to listen to me talking about it and trying to explain it. So we are going to keep the videos flowing, and we have the changes to the section 21 that's coming up. I'll be doing a video on that. And I'm also going to be doing a video on the Homes Fitness for Human Habitation Act, because I think that's probably still a little bit cloudy for some people, so we're going to be doing that. But for now, let's crack on with the tenant fee ban and let's get learning. Obviously, we've talked briefly about the tenant fee ban on our video that was from the seminar we ran, but basically now I'm going to give you a more in-depth overview of everything and break each a little bit down really to say exactly what we can and can't charge and what we can and can't do with respect to tenants coming into tenancies and also existing tenancies and what we need to do with those after the transition period. I'll come on to what transition period is in a minute. So first up, we are looking at what fees can we ask the tenants to pay. There are a few fees that we can still ask tenants to pay. Some of these are only kind of concerns for agents, some of them are concerns for landlords, but it's good for you to know everything. So we can still ask tenants to pay the rent. Fantastic. We can still ask tenants to pay the rent. No worries there. Next up, we can ask them to pay a refundable tenancy deposit. So as we do now, tenants pay a deposit when they move in. It is obviously refundable, subject to any dilapidations or any deductions we need to make, but we can ask them to pay a refundable tenancy deposit. Brilliant. I'll come on to that in a minute. Next up is a refundable holding deposit. So where previously we would have charged an admin fee, you cannot do that anymore. No. You can only charge a refundable holding deposit. And again, we'll come on to further detail about each of these individually in a moment. You can still charge for payments that change tenancy agreement. They've just capped this to £50. So if a tenant comes to you and wants to make an adaptation to their tenancy agreement, that's absolutely fine. You can charge them £50 to do so. Lovely. Early termination. Now, we've had quite a lot of this recently, actually. The government are trying to bring in this kind of concept that tenants want long-term tenancy agreements and all this malarkey. Well, we're getting a lot of tenants that sign 12, 18-month contracts and then actually want to vacate from their premises early. So if a tenant is in that position and wants to do that during a fixed term, that's called an early termination. It's agreeable by the landlord, so you can not agree to it, but it's not usually seen very well by the courts if you don't agree to it, but we can now charge tenants to do that. So whatever your loss would be, so in your case, probably your reletting fee you'd be paying earlier than you'd intended to, we can charge that back to the tenants. Next up is you can still charge the tenants for utilities, communications, TV licences and council tax bills. So basically all the bills that are liable with the tenancy agreement, we can still obviously ensure that tenants are paying those. So although that's a clause within a tenancy agreement, that is still standing and we can still use that. So we can still insist they pay their bills. Finally, default fees. This has been kind of really reduced to what they see as a default. You can still charge default fee for late rent and you can still charge default fee for lost keys or security devices. So if it's a gated entrance and they can only get in with a button and they've lost their button, then you can charge them obviously for that. It's seen as reasonable costs. I see reasonable costs as the cost of the actual item replacement and however long it's taking you to do it, charging for your time. But you need to be able to evidence that. And that's the bit that's going to get people out. But we'll move on to that later. So looking at these individually and breaking them down, the rent. Okay, you think this is quite a straightforward one, but because obviously some agents are going to be losing quite a considerable amount of money by not being able to charge their admin fees, etc., etc., they've tried to come up with some glorious ways of not losing out on this money. And one of those is being by paying increased amounts of rent. When it comes to charging rent, you can only charge the same amount of rent throughout the whole tenancy unless there has also been a rent increase implemented within the tenancy agreement, which is standard. So you cannot have a tenancy agreement that's 12 months, and let's say the rent is £500 a month. You cannot charge £800 for the first month, keep that £300 extra, and then charge £500 every month after that. That's not allowed. The rent is £500, you must charge £500 every month until they hit a clause in the tenancy agreement which says they might have a rent increase, but obviously that's not going to be £300 a month rent increase, is it? So we're going to be looking at that. So rent increases can be put into tenancy agreements, so they come in automatically, which is really, really handy. You can do it kind of now, but it's not really seen as kind of enforceable at the moment, but that's going to become quite a strong thing. That's something we're going to really look at using for you. So there's automatic rent increases within the tenancy agreements. So after a certain amount of time, the rent will automatically increase. Next up, refundable tenancy deposits. So this is obviously one of the ones we've talked about quite a lot. There's quite a few big changes coming in. So you can only have 5 weeks if your tenancy earns less than £50,000 a year. If your tenancy earns more than £50,000 a year, you can take 6 weeks. But just for that perspective, £50,000 a year is just over £4,000 a month. I haven't got any clients that have rents that are £4,000 a month. So for us, all we're concerned about is £50,000 and under, 5 weeks deposit as of the 1st of June 2019, lovely jubbly, off we go. That's all you need to worry about. Very straightforward, 5 weeks deposit, can't take any extra for pets, there's no if, whats or buts about it, it's 5 weeks. With the withdrawal of the admin fee, the biggest question that came up, not just from agents but from landlords also, is how do you get a financial commitment from a tenant to know they actually want to apply for your property? And that's where the refundable holding deposit comes in. Now, we've talked briefly about the holding deposit in a couple of ways, and I'm going to go into a bit more detail about those. So first things first is the holding deposit amount has to be equivalent to 1 week and no more's worth of rent. Okay, so I personally round down, if it's a bit of an odd number, if it's got like 97 pence or something, round it down to the next round number. Let's not be taking silly amounts off people to make it difficult. Let's be fair, but make sure you're not going to leave yourself in a position where you're incompliant. So always round down to the nearest number, do not round up. Second thing is we can only hold that amount of money for 15 days unless we get written confirmation of tenants otherwise. So what we're going to be doing is in our application forms, there's going to be a section in there that says what date would you like to move in, blah, blah, blah. If this date is 15 days later or more than the date you've signed this application form, do you agree for us to hold this amount of money until whatever date they want to move in on? The other thing is we have to be really careful when it comes to tenancy holding deposits is the fact it's called a deposit. Now, if you are holding that amount of money for more than 30 days, you leave yourself potentially liable if you haven't specified otherwise to the falling foul of the deposit regulations, which means you have to have a deposit registered within 30 days. Okay, so what we need to be doing is when we are putting in our application forms, we need to be saying that this money, if the application is successful, will go towards the first month's rent, not the tenancy deposit. First month's rent, very, very important. But we'll sort that out for you anyway, it's fully managed, so haven't worried about it too much, but just to let you know. So we've got 15 days, we've got 1 week's rent maximum, nothing more, round it down. Finally, we've got the fact that we need to make sure that we are listing the holding deposits going towards the first month's rent, not towards the deposit. So default fees, the first thing we need to look at is the fact that any of these default fees we would like to charge needs to be written into tenancy agreement. We are amending our tenancy agreements as we speak. They are already in there in some cases, but the historic ones aren't. So we're trying to update everything so that they are all there. But basically, we cannot charge a default fee for late rent payments if the rent isn't over 14 days late. So that's okay, so when it comes to charging for late rent payments, the amount we can charge is 3% and no more than 3%. So just 3%, remember what I said before, round down if you are on an odd number, above the Bank of England base rate per day. So that's how much you can charge. When it comes to keys and security devices, as I think I've said previously before, cost of the item itself to replace, and then a fair amount of money for your time to organise it. That would be seen as fair and reasonable. Okay, so moving on to changes to tenancies. The first thing is that we have to make sure that we're being seen to be reasonable, so we shouldn't be declining requests to change tenancy agreements unless obviously it's a substantial change that isn't seen as a fair clause, but otherwise we should be allowing these changes to happen and we can charge £50 for that. For example, if you've got a single occupant and the property can take and withstand having another occupant and they'd like to move their boyfriend or girlfriend in, you can charge them £50 to make the change to tenancy agreement and do that work. So you can still charge for your time there, which I think actually is really good because we can't really charge much of our time anywhere else. So change the tenancy agreement, £50. If you think it is reasonable to charge more than £50, you'd have to evidence that. In my opinion, charge £50 that you know you can charge happily and be done with that. It's not worth the argument if you do get it just a little bit wrong. Okay, so when it comes to terminating a tenancy early, at the tenant's request, basically the fee for this is capped at the landlord's loss or the agent's reasonable costs. We don't really incur massive costs that would be different to what it would be at a normal let. So it's more looking at the landlord's loss, which would obviously be the fact that they're not anticipating having to cover the cost of changing tenancy at that point in time, and also the fact that they might have some days without rent. So basically how we work it and how it's seen by the guidance notes is, to be fair, is that it covers the cost of the landlord's relet and it covers the cost of rent up until the new tenant moves in. The cost of the rent cannot, basically, the whole of the cost completely cannot go further than what the rent would have been due for the period that the tenant's leaving. So let's say the tenancy is due to end on the 30th of June and the tenant wants to vacate on the 1st of April. So you've got the whole of April, whole of May, whole of June. It's got 3 months, get for the camera, 3 months rent there that needs to be paid. Let's say the rent is £500 a month, so it's £1,500. So you've got basically £1,500 to play with as such. So if you found someone to move in on the 30th of April, so they've got a month there, so the tenant would be liable to pay that month's rent, so £500 for that bit, plus the cost of landlord's relet. That's going to be less than £1,500. It's perfectly reasonable. That's what we'll be charging. When it comes to council tax, utilities, communications, TV licence, things like that, I'm not going to go into that massively because it's quite self-explanatory. There's no change there basically whatsoever. It just confirmed that we are allowed to have that in our tenancy agreement still, to say that the tenant is liable for those costs. Whilst they live in a property, the tenant is liable, unless it's included with the rent, obviously, to pay the utilities and the supplies to the property for the use of it, really. So, when does the ban apply? Where does it apply? Who does it apply to? And all those lovely things. So, the ban comes in on the 1st of June 2019. However, if you have an existing tenancy that you set up before the 1st of June 2019 that has charges within it that are different to the ones you're allowed to charge as of the 1st of June, you can still charge those for the transition period. Now, I've talked about this transition period for a couple of times in this video. I probably mentioned it prior times before that. The transition period is the first year of the law, the legislation, the ban. So it runs from the 1st of June 2019 to the 31st of May 2020, and then the 1st of June 2020 becomes it retrospectively. So basically, existing tenancies that you've already started, you can charge those default fees that you've got in there until 31st of May 2020. New tenancies, 1st of June 2019, no. Stick with the new charges, much easier. Don't get caught out. So we've talked existing tenancies, we've talked new tenancies. What about existing tenancies that were new? So if you have a tenancy that you started before the 1st of June 2019, so let's say 1st of January 2019, and it comes to the start of December and we're looking at renewal, if we renew that tenancy onto a new fixed term, if we extend that tenancy and renew it onto a new fixed term, the ban comes in at that point. So then we need to be looking at deposit things, which I'll go to more in a minute, and we'll need to be looking at putting the correct default fees into tenancy agreements and making sure they're not being charged. I think they shouldn't be charged for. However, we can still charge for that renewal at that point in time because that's before the 31st of May 2020. Okay, so a question I've been asked quite a lot is who is going to be governing this, who's going to be enforcing it? It comes down to trading standards. Trading standards are going to be the enforcing body for the tenant fee ban. So they're taking it quite seriously, and there are a few district councils that aren't governed by the trading standards. They are allowed to take it into their own hands to deal with it, and obviously all the charges and fees that are liable for breaches would go back to local councils, so they will be quite hot on it. What they have actually put into this guidance notes, which I think is really, really handy, is actually a bit of a Q&A on each section. So at the end of this video, I will be doing probably 3 or 4 questions from each section and doing it as a Q&A, so you can kind of, hopefully it answers some of your questions you might have, and also it gives you opportunity perhaps to generate some ideas of questions you might have, which I can answer for you, as I've now got the absolute answer to what everything is. So we are getting there with tenant fee ban. We're probably nearly halfway through. I'm on page 25, 59 page document, so we are nearly there. But sorry, hair on my face. But yes, one of the questions we have got that's come up prior is because currently we request that tenants have insurance to cover accidental damage to landlord's fixtures and fittings. We cannot at the moment request they have insurance to cover their own contents, which a couple of tenants have been caught out by, and I do use that as kind of case knowledge to try and encourage tenants to take contents insurance out because it is beneficial to them. But we do ask that they have accidental damage to landlord's fixtures and fittings. We can't do that anymore. We can highly recommend they take out tenants insurance, which most tenants insurance policies cover accidental damage to landlords, fixtures and fittings. Put my teeth in. But we can't demand it anymore, so that is something we are going to have to change and just tweak a little bit within our application forms and tenancy agreements. Another really important thing that's come up is chimney sweeping. That has been, if you take a property currently that has a chimney breast in it that's usable, open fire, can be used. Currently, it's a tenant's responsibility to have the chimney swept before they use that fire. We can't do that anymore. You cannot request that the tenant does that on their for their use. If you are providing a property and you are saying that chimney breast is usable, it must be provided in a usable condition, which means it must have already been swept before they've moved in. If you've done that and then they cause damage or something like that, you can then obviously claim back the damage costs from their deposit, but initially you must be getting the chimney swept before they move in. Okay, so tenancy deposits, let's go in a bit more detail. Right, first thing is, it is a tenancy deposit per tenancy, not per tenant. So you can't be asking, if you've got 3 tenants, for example, you can't be asking each one of those tenants to pay 5 weeks deposit. It is the 5 weeks deposit amount split between those 3 tenants, however they want to organise it, but you want to be receiving it in one lump sum. Okay, so 1 tenancy, 1 deposit, not per tenant. First thing to remember. Again, we're going back to the fact we are looking at 5 weeks. Now we're going to be really careful how we work out those 5 weeks because everyone does it a little bit differently. How I've set it out is if you're looking at 5 weeks deposit, you take the monthly rent, times it by 12, divide it by 52, and times it by 5. Okay, 5 weeks deposit. That is how we're calculating it. I am inclined to round it down, so if it's a funny decimal number, so I don't know, £575 and 43p, I probably would be rounding it down to £575. I don't think the 43p is going to make the biggest difference in the world, so that's how we're going to be doing it. We do like to try and keep things on round numbers because it's easier when it comes to returning deposits at the end and dilapidations, things like that. You know exactly how much money you got to work from. So yes, and you've still got to obviously abide by the deposit regulation terms. So it has to be registered with a governing body, so one of the 3 schemes, and it has to be registered within 30 days. So that is still exactly the same, but it's capped at 5 weeks. Okay, so we're nearly there. The biggest kind of issue that came up when we were talking at the last seminar, and I've raised quite a few times with ARLA, the Association of Residential Letting Agents, who are my governing body, and everyone else has, and with our deposit suppliers, is like we manage 65 to 70 properties. If we have to start returning a week's worth of rent from all of those, that's going to be a lot of admin, it's going to be a lot of work, tenancy agreement's going to be incorrect, got to reissue prescribed information, there's a lot of work that's got to go into that, but who's going to pay for that? Because we're not going to do it for free, let's be honest. However, and the reason why I kind of think it came up at the seminar about what we would be charging for that, I didn't give an answer to it because I didn't know how they were going to be doing it, to be honest, and it has come back like I thought it would do, which is absolutely brilliant, which is that basically, whilst a tenancy is after the 1st of June 2020, you can't charge these unpermitted costs. You've already taken the deposit, so it's not an unpermitted charge because you already hold it. So you keep hold of that deposit and then you return it as you would normally at the end of the tenancy. If you renew that tenancy agreement at any point in time after the 1st of June 2020 or on the 1st of June 2020, then you need to be adjusting the deposit at that point in time at renewal. How the deposit companies are going to do that yet, I'm not quite sure. But what we probably will be doing, or I plan to be doing if they don't come up with anything otherwise, is I will be getting a deposit, requesting 5 weeks of that deposit to be paid to us as a deduction, paying them back 1 week, and then I'll resubmit the other 5 weeks and we'll re-register it that way. That's quite straightforward and easy, and that's part of the renewal process. So that's how we'll be doing it. So there will be no charge for massive amounts of paperwork and lots of work to be done, and it hasn't got to be a mad rush, which is absolutely brilliant. It's just going to be a case of, as long as it doesn't renew after the 1st of June 2020, just leave the deposit as it is, let it sit there, and at the end of that tenancy, you release that deposit as you would do. And if you do renew it, you need to obviously adjust that deposit to be in 5 weeks in line with the new tenancy agreement, which will have obviously the new default fees and things like that in it. Okay, so moving on from the main topics, we're going to do a few questions and answers that they provided us with that I think are actually really good and helpful. Hopefully it will make some sense to you and answer some questions you've got. And also I think it kind of also runs through a few things that are actually probably in law now that landlords don't realise, and sometimes I try and explain things and people don't always listen. So it's in here, so listen up. Right, question. Can I charge a tenant for a professional clean at the end of a tenancy? No, is the answer to that. You cannot, I'll read you exactly what is on the answers here. You cannot require a tenant to pay for a professional clean when they check out. However, if the tenancy was entered into before the 1st of June 2019 and a tenant agreed in their contract to pay such fees, you can charge these fees up until the 31st of May 2020, as I've said many times before. With the 1st of June 2020, the term requiring the payment will no longer be binding from the tenant. You may request the property is cleaned to a professional standard, and that's the point I try and make to people quite a lot that don't understand. You cannot request a professional clean, you can only request it to be cleaned to a professional standard. Tenants are responsible for ensuring that the property is returned in the condition they found it, aside from fair wear and tear. The fair wear and tear is considered to be a defect which occur naturally as part of the tenant's responsible use of the premises. So basically, if it's sparkling clean when they go in and it's not sparkling clean when they go out, you can charge them for that as a damage, not as a charge. You cannot require a tenant to use a particular company to clean the property. If the property is not left in a fit condition, you can recover costs associated with returning the property to its original condition and or carrying out necessary repairs by claiming against tenancy deposit. We recommend a cleaning company as an option when they fill in their checkout form. They don't have to take it. There is no obligation for them to do so, but it's just an option if they would like it. Once they've handed those keys back, then they don't get a choice on who cleans it. Okay. You should justify your costs by providing suitable evidence, i.e. an invoice, and the inventory normally. You are not able to claim deductions from a tenant's deposit for any change in the condition of property which is due to fair wear and tear, or if a tenant returns the property in the same condition it was found. You cannot have betterment from a tenancy, and that will not change ever. That has not changed with this. That will just not change. You cannot have betterment. Okay, great question. Okay, so another question for you. Can I require a tenant to obtain a reference? Okay, so this comes from the fact, obviously, that we can't now charge tenants to go through the referencing process. So instead of us doing it and being charged for it and not earning any money from it, can we charge tenants to do it instead? No. You cannot require a tenant to obtain a reference to a third-party reference service as a condition of granting a tenancy, but a tenant could opt to obtain such a reference voluntarily. You can ask a tenant to supply reference from a former landlord or agent, but the previous landlord or agent cannot charge the tenant for this. If you request a reference directly from a tenant's previous landlord or agent and they want to charge for doing this, you'll have to negotiate this with the previous landlord or agent directly and pay any associated costs if required. This is my absolute pet hate. We do not charge our tenants to provide a reference. They've been our tenants for a period of time. We have information that no one else can get hold of because we have it here. Why are we charging to do that? A reference literally takes me 30 seconds to complete. But moving forward, agents will still want to make money from that and they will want to charge for it. I personally will not be taking the charge for any agents that want to charge me for it. Okay? I don't think any agents will, because I think that's completely unfair and I think it will be seen as unreasonable if the government catch on to it. But yeah, I will not be stomaching the charge of a previous landlord's request. Okay. Next question. If a tenant cannot afford to pay the tenancy deposit, can I increase the rent as an alternative to taking a deposit? The first point on this is if a tenant can't afford to pay a deposit, it shouldn't rent it in the first place because they probably haven't got good money management. Second thing is no. The rent has to be seen as fair and even to equal standard properties and equal quality properties around them. If you are charging more because you're adding the deposit onto that rent, that won't be the case, and therefore you'll be falling foul and that additional amount will have to be returned to the tenant. So no. You can obviously suggest things like deposit replacement schemes, and some companies will loan tenants money for deposits and then they pay them back separately. Yes, they can do that, that's absolutely fine, but no, you cannot increase the rent to cover an extra deposit. Next up, if a tenant paid a tenancy deposit which exceeds the cap before the 1st of June 2019, do we need to repay the amount of the deposit above the cap? Nope. Landlords and letting agents are not obliged to immediately refund part of a tenancy deposit that is above the cap that was paid before the 1st of June 2019. If a tenant signed a tenancy agreement before the 1st of June 2019 and that tenancy is continuing or is a statutory periodic agreement, I'm going to amend that slightly. We don't have statutory periodic agreements anymore. We have contractual periodic agreements, because that means that if it's statutory, if it's a bit tricky. With contractual tenancy agreements, you're contractually saying to them, you will be carrying on this tenancy agreement on a periodic basis after this date is finished, unless you notify us that you want to leave before this date, which means when it comes to council tax and things like that, you're much more covered. So we don't do statutory, we do contractual. I'm surprised they've put statutory in here, to be honest. Tenancy is continuing or is a contractual periodic agreement, then the tenant will be bound by the terms of that contract until it is either renewed or terminated. So as I said previously, after the 1st of June 2019, if you renew that tenancy agreement, then it will change then, but otherwise it can stay. 2 more questions and then we're done. So second to last is, what are my responsibilities when it comes to a holding deposit? Which is quite an important question, I think. And there's a few points they've raised on this. So the first one is that you should provide tenants with clear information about why you're requesting a holding deposit, including the sum that is required and the circumstances where they may lose all or part of their deposit in accordance with the Tenant Fees Act 2019. And the next one is, you should not waste the tenant's time. You should be clear and upfront with tenants about your expectations and check that they meet the basic income and credit worthiness requirements before taking a holding deposit from them. If you consider that they will not be a suitable tenant, you should not take a holding deposit from them. You may do this by having an informal discussion with the tenant about the requirements of the property, e.g. an acceptable level of income, which is what any good agent and any good landlord should be doing. We should be kind of doing the basic checks to go through before they're reviewed. So, that's quite straightforward. You should provide your tenant with a copy of the tenancy agreement before taking the holding deposit. This we've had been doing anyway, so it's no different. We have to do that now. So it's just a reminder, really, that you've got to give a copy of the tenancy agreement prior to taking the holding deposit. Next up, you should clearly define what you consider to be credit worthiness. Tenants should have a clear understanding of what might count against them so that they have the opportunity to provide any relevant information. If this includes previous missed and late payments, you should make this clear to the tenant. So we've got to be really, really precise in our application forms about what we expect. So on our application forms, no bankruptcies, no CCJs, no late payments. If you have any of those things on your account, you will not be accepted. And I think I might be adding in what we expect your credit score to be, but it is slightly tricky because each different credit association rates them slightly differently, so it's a little bit tricky of that. But yeah, definitely no CCJs, definitely no bankruptcies, and definitely no late payments. That's what we're looking for. Okay, so the final Q&A we've got here is, do I have to explain to a tenant why I've retained their holding deposit? When we say retained, it's if there's been a fail on the reference or something like that. The answer is yes. If you decide to retain all or part of your holding deposit, you must be able to provide written evidence and explain the grounds for your decision. If a tenant disagrees with your decision or you do not provide a reasonable explanation or supporting evidence, a tenant can challenge your decision through the local authority using the trading standards, a redress scheme if it concerns an agent, or via the first tier tribunal. You must set out in writing to the tenant why you're retaining their holding deposit. A tenant is automatically entitled to have their holding deposit returned if you do not do this within 7 days of deciding not to let the property in. This is before the deadline agreement, so that's before your 15 days. 7 days of the deadline agreement passing, so if you haven't confirmed to them that you're going to hold it for more than 15 days, go 7 days past that, they're automatically entitled to it back. Any written explanation should set out clearly the grounds under which you are entitled to retain their deposit, ideally any evidence which you have to support this. So this comes back to when we're talking about our application form, what we have to provide and what our responsibility is. We have to be really, really clear what we expect from the tenants. If they say that they earn £25,000 a year and that's going to pass the referencing comes back and says they earn 10, that is their fault. They've provided false information, you're entitled to hold that deposit, but you need to have the application form that states that's what they said in the first place to be able to argue it, because you're going to need the application form that says they said 25, the reference report which says they had 10, and say, bam, you don't earn that much money, you've provided false information, and therefore we're going to keep your holding deposit. Okay? So thank you all for listening to my update on the tenant fee ban. I've tried to make it as kind of exciting and as innovative as we can possibly do so. I'm not going to sit here and read you a 59-page document, but I hope that the Q&As at the end there did help cover some of the questions you might have had. If you have got any more questions, please pop me an email, give me a call, whatever it might be. And if I get lots of questions, I'm happy to do another Q&A video to cover all those, so that covers a few of your points. We are working as hard as we can in the background here to make sure everything's ready for the 1st of June. And if you're a fully managed client, I can guarantee you we will be compliant by that point in time, and everything will be fine. So you've got nothing to worry about. If you're a let-only client, and after watching this and reading the information we've given to you prior, and you're thinking, I'm a bit concerned that I might not be able to keep up to all the requirements of this, or you have some concerns, feel free to come in, organise a time to sit down with me, and we'll go through how we can possibly help you. Hope you'll have a lovely evening, and I'll catch you on the next video.